My guest today is Professor Peter Carruthers, who is Professor of Philosophy at University of Maryland. His primary research interests include philosophy of mind, philosophy of psychology, and cognitive science. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks very much. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So we want to talk about your book, Innateness in Mind. And as I mentioned, Peter, I have no background in philosophy or science, so this would be an interesting conversation. And just like anybody who has a short attention span, I sort of jumped into the back of the book, summary and conclusions. And I think it's a good place for us to start to set the context. You say here, nativism is richly true of the human mind. Not only are there numerous specialized learning systems inherited from our animal ancestors, but we possess a number of other specialized adaptations that are either unique to our species or involve significant changes to those we share with other great apes. It is unclear how much of the human capacity for language is innately channeled beyond an expectation of hierarchical and movable phrases and powerful motivations to identify and attend to language, as well as to communicate with others. Yeah, we want to talk a bit more about that. And likewise, it's unclear how much of the human mentalizing faculty is unique to us. So, nativism, I would imagine there's an opposing view. Is that called experimentalism, or what's the right term?
It's called empiricism.
Empiricism.
So,
Okay.
The nativist empiricist debate goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks and was a big deal in the Enlightenment with people like Descartes and Leibniz on the nativist side and people like Locke and Hume on the empiricist side.
Yeah, so just define it a little bit for me. So I am very attracted to this idea. So I want to just get your insights on artificial intelligence a little bit later, because all the noise that's happening in the technology arena, and it has some implications. These ideas have some implications for it, I think. So I spent about 40 years in the periphery of what is now called AI. I would rather call it intelligent automation or something like that. In any case, there's a lot of training going on. So define a little bit. So the basic idea I understand is that when a baby is born, is she coming with some sort of basic operating system, some basic applications that she is using to sort of get into the world, or is it a blank slate? I don't know. Yeah.
That's roughly what the debate is, right? Whether all the baby starts with is obviously some specialized sensory systems, right? I mean, that's not all blank. We know the visual system is all wired up and the auditory system is all wired up and so on. But in further in from the input systems, the sensory systems, the blank slate people think, well, it's just one great big learning engine, and learning about anything uses the same general learning principles as anything else. Or maybe there might be a small set of them. There might be associative learning, and there might be what scientists call inference to the best explanation, something like theory building that would be perfectly general.
Yeah.
Whereas nativists think that for a number of different domains, we come pre-prepared with perhaps some initial default information built in, and you've got a learning mechanism that builds on that. And that's what people have thought about the language faculty, and what I'm inclined to think is true of what's called mentalizing, or the theory of mind faculty, that enables us to understand one another's mental states.
Yeah, so the language part is interesting, isn't it? I mean, humans, I don't know, maybe 2,000 years, language, humans had language.
Oh, well, no. Probably way back. I mean, it's really hard to tell from fossils, of course, because this is in the brain.
Yeah.
But the lowered larynx and the stuff that we use physiologically in language has been in place for a long time. I mean, at least 70,000 years, and maybe as much as 200,000.
So at least 200,000. So that is sufficient time frame for evolution and selection
Sure.
to happen, I would imagine, right? So,
Yeah.
and language in the modern world is a really uh, really important selection mechanism. Um, those who can express ideas, feelings, complex subjects will be selected, I would imagine. I mean, we have a complex world right now, so language is an integral part of it. So if you say 100,000 years ago, people started shouting at each other, let's call it language. Uh, yeah, I would imagine, those who said there's a line over there or there is a water hole over here, would have been the chief of the clan, I would imagine, right? I mean, that is great information.
Clans didn't have chiefs. It was very egalitarian, right? Chiefs only come in when you get settled communities with the invention of agriculture about 10,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Hunter-gatherer tribes tend to be much less hierarchical and much more prestige-based rather than hierarchical.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, no one knows what the initial forces on the evolution of language were. I mean, some have speculated that it was actually gossip
Yeah.
because small-scale communities are policed basically by gossip. Everything
Yeah.
turns on your reputation and whether people want to help you or cooperate with you or they ridicule you.
Hmm.
And so information can pass really fast around a largish group
Hmm.
if you step out of line or if you do something bad and so on. And so it may be that the initial selection pressure had to do with social policing and social coordination rather than exchange of information about the other
Communication.
world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what would you say? So 100,000 years is a long time. So going back to the nativistic argument here, um, selection pressures, evolution. Is it sort of? I'm going to make a computer analogy here, Peter. You can do whatever you want to do with it. So when Windows 11 it comes with some basic operating system. We know we have some basic operating system because babies need to know how to move their legs and arms and all of that. Um, but then it also comes with some applications that may be sort of innate in the babies. And those applications, are they sort of installed because of evolution? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, that's the thought. I mean, we although it's still to some extent, well, fairly controversial what the innate human specific systems are. We know quite a lot about animals, and we know that animals do approximate number. They can estimate the numerosity of a set. They can add and subtract and multiply sets,
Hmm.
right, in approximate form. We know they have a very different system for well, a number of different systems that enable navigating. They can do dead reckoning.
Hmm.
Even ants can do dead reckoning. They can keep track of where they are from home as they move across the featureless desert floor, integrating together an estimate of how far they've walked in each direction and then the angle they turn to each time they turn.
Hmm.
But there are also geometric systems that store the roughly geometric layout of an environment. There are simple causality systems that basically have a sort of simple physics emulator built into them for predicting what's going to happen if one thing bumps into another thing and that sort of thing.
Hmm.
And so that the mind is richly endowed with domain specific systems, as we say, systems that are designed to focus on a particular kind of topic like causality or number.
Hmm.
Um, it, I mean, I don't I don't think anyone should deny that data. There's just too much of that, right?
Yeah.
The interesting remaining question is, are there any extra systems that have been installed into the human mind
Yeah.
in addition to all those?
Hmm. Yeah. So my naive thinking here, Peter, is that there are two types of systems, right? One is sort of I don't know if it's the right term, but sort of process system, meaning the baby is given some way to process incoming information and make her own decisions and choices. The other is sort of a knowledge system, meaning the baby expects something. It's already sort of embedded into the brain. Um, I don't know what human babies can do. I mean, if the lion comes to eat the baby, sorry to make it so gruesome, the baby cannot do anything. Um,
No,
and so perhaps it is about, recognizing faces, recognizing maybe more friendly faces as opposed to not so friendly faces, stuff like that. So there's some data there, right? So, yeah, so where do you stand? Is it the process knowledge that we come with, or is it the sort of the content knowledge?
probably a bit of both. So in the what's sometimes called the naive physics system or the physics emulator system, we know that infants have expectations as soon as you can start to measure them. I mean, by the age of 3 or 4 months. And this is measured using expectancy looking time. So you have
Mm,
two groups of infants and you show all the infants the same sort of startup. And then one group gets shown one finishing and the other group shows the other.
mm,
Looking times differ between the two groups. If they're surprised, they look
mm.
longer, right? It's as everyone does, right? You're surprised by something, sort of puzzled and look at it.
Yeah,
Um, so that's maybe basically a process system that you feed it with input about the motions of objects and
yeah.
one object approaching another. Um, the other systems that have been talked about, like say the mentalizing system, and we know little infants are tracking the mental states of the people
Mhm,
around them. How rich that is still disputed,
mhm.
but it's likely to have certain primitives in it, like goal, right?
Yeah.
What someone's aiming at, trying to do. It can, and the process bit here is it has a way of computing what would be an efficient path to a goal. So if you show an infant a little cartoon with, say, a square, and they'll treat
Mm,
self-moving objects as agents, right? A
mm,
square that approaches another one, jumping over an obstacle and going,
mm.
oh, and then you take the obstacle away, they're puzzled if it still jumps. Although the physical motion is exactly as what it was
Mm,
before.
mm.
Right? So, it should be familiar. They're puzzled if it doesn't go in a straight line, right? Because if you want to get there and there's nothing in the way, why wouldn't you go in a straight line, right? So that
Yeah.
might have some primitives in, like
Mm,
agent and goal. Um, Maybe some people think, well, I think that um, think or belief is a conceptual primitive that infants start with as well, and they're tracking what people believe about the world around them, as well as what they
mm.
can see, what they can hear. Um, yeah, so a bit of
So,
both.
sorry to interrupt. So I was thinking about, sort of intuition and deduction. So deduction for me, I don't know anything about philosophy, Peter. So I'm making all this up. Deduction for me is sort of a process thing, which is I'm going to give you a software. I'm going to give you an algorithm that you can take inputs, come up with a consistent output from it. Intuition, though, sounds like more content. It's like, yeah, there's an app in there when the baby happens. Is that the right way to think about it?
Um, I don't think so. I mean, certainly not with deduction. I mean, there may be very simple um, logical abilities that are innate, and there's some dispute about whether they're present in other animals too, like the
Mm,
disjunctive syllogism, right? So if it's either here or here, and it's not here, it must be here, right?
yeah.
That kind of thing. It's not easy to test, and there's some debate about it. Um, and most of cognition is basically statistical,
Mm,
right? So it's going to be noisy and statistical, um, and what we call intuitions are just when the processing that isn't conscious issues in an answer or a belief or an expectation that
mm,
is, right? So there's still a process going on in there. It's still cognition happening in the background. which can be more or less reliable.
It's a bit tricky, isn't it? So when the baby is in the womb of the mother, she is still getting a lot of data, I would imagine. And so by the time she is born, it is not Windows 11 with nothing on it. I mean,
She
it
can
has been collecting
recognize
data, right? Yeah.
she can recognize her mother's language from the cadence, which is basically all she gets in the womb. It's kind of, because it's muffled. But newborn babies can distinguish the cadence of their native language from that of a different language. But not an awful lot more in the way of information being received. There's sound, and of course there's tactile sensations as the mother moves around, but nothing like seeing different numbers of things. I mean, right?
She also gets sort of auditory, yeah, like you say, the auditory information too. So this makes the experiments, I mean, we cannot really have any invasive experiments, obviously. Um, but this makes the experiments very, very difficult, right? So this debate between nativism and empiricism, um, if you want to test it at some level, some scientific level, in humans, it makes it quite difficult, doesn't it?
Yes, I mean, not as difficult as you might think, because it turns out that infants that are 3 or 4 months old that have had very limited experience
Yeah.
have expectations about things that, so far as one can tell, they have had no experience of.
Hmm.
Right? But yeah, it's of course everything is still to some degree controversial. Partly you have to think of what makes best sense of the totality of the evidence, as always in science.
Yeah.
There's very little that gets proved.
Yeah, so I saw an experiment, Peter. I'm sure you've seen this. It's like I think it was from Italy. These are chicks,
So
so they get the
Valtioga,
eggs.
yeah,
Sorry.
Valtioga is the guy's name. Yeah,
Okay, so they get this eggs from this nearby hatchery, and they hatch the eggs at night. Sorry, in darkness, I should say. And then they run them through multiple sort of experiments. One is no geographical information, like a cylinder or something like that, so you don't have any edges on it, and others like in a box or something like that. If I understand this correctly, what we found is that their intuition is well developed regardless of the environment they've been hatched in. Uh, for those who are worried about this experiment, the chicks were returned back to the hatchery without any problem. But so that's sort of an interesting experiment, isn't it?
yeah, and that line of research has been continued by I'm blanking on the guy's first name, but it's Wood at Indiana who does experiments with chicks. I mean, the advantage of chicks is that they come out of the egg able to move around. So you can see what they approach and what they don't approach, and you can totally control their environment. So you know, down to the last minute exactly what it is that they can see. Um, but there've been similar experiments done with, say, monkeys, where um, monkeys have been reared in a way that never involves seeing a face. That the humans who care for them have a sack over their heads when they come in,
Yeah.
but they can immediately recognize faces and distinguish different faces from one another when first exposed. So that's some kind of evidence that at least among the input systems, the face
Yeah.
processing system is specified in advance.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the faces are quite an important survival mechanism.
Sure.
So intuitively, I would think recognizing faces or assigning some probability if it's a friendly face or a non-friendly face is obviously important for most most mammals, or perhaps even further down from there. And so this goes to the sort of the critical question here, which is, has evolution implemented some native programs into our brain? Or is it that we come with a blank slate and then we learn everything from experience? My intuition tells me that it is likely the former. I think that's where you are too, right?
And I think there's a lot of evidence that is the former. Right? I mean, from the animal studies, which are fairly decisive, through to the infancy studies, which there's still some dispute about some of them, but I think most in the field accept the findings.
So, if you have any sort of discomfort in this hypothesis, if there is any, where would that be?
You mean where are the weak points, or?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Well, as the hypothesis overall, I don't think there is an obvious weak point with each particular hypothesis. I mean, so in the language case, for example, it started off with Noam Chomsky back in the 50s, 60s, as a really rich hypothesis. The claim was that human mind came with a fully specified universal grammar, which is basically what all languages are supposed to have in common.
Yeah.
And that got weakened by Chomsky himself over the years, so that now maybe it's more just the expectation of hierarchical phrase structure, right? That the sounds you hear are going to split up into words and phrases, and the phrases are things that can be moved around as chunks relative to one another. And there's still now a lot of debate about how much richer the innate findings may be or not, right? And the classic arguments here were so-called poverty of stimulus arguments, where if you can find that infants or young children know something about their language which they've never been exposed to, and which you couldn't straightforwardly generalize from what they have been exposed to, then that's evidence that somehow that what it is that they know was encoded in their mind from the start. But each case of those sorts that is put up is disputed by others, and it's controversial, and it is hard to test.
Yeah. Just at the, without knowing anything about it, it seems a bit counterintuitive for me, because to get a syntax in language implemented without any sort of outside data, there has to be
any data.
Sorry?
There's always data, of course. But look, let me give you the strongest case, which is a natural experiment. Well, two things first. One is the urge to communicate appears to be innate. And we know that from deaf children who are brought up in hearing families and are never exposed to language at all. There's not many people in that situation now, except if you go into some regions of the third world, you'll find people situated like that. But back when this work was being done in the 80s and 90s, it was quite common to find kids who had never been exposed to any language. Now they create their own language called home sign. It's relatively simple, but it consists of 2 or 3 words or combined together in different orders. But they can use it to communicate with their families about a number of distant events. They can tell stories. They can even comment on the signs themselves. And we know they're not learning those signs from their parents. I mean, on the contrary, when you look carefully, the parents are copying them and doing it much more crudely than that. Okay, so the drive to communicate and the invention of at least a simple language system seems to be there from the start. And then there's a famous case that was studied in real time when back in the early 90s, I think, or was it the 80s? Forget. The Nicaraguan government created the first school for the deaf,
Hmm.
and they brought in deaf children from the various villages and all around the country to start them being educated in their school. Now, each of those kids had their own home sign,
Hmm.
right? You put these kids together, and initially they were discouraged, I think, from using signs. They were trying to
Hmm.
teach them to speak, right? And this is the way it was done early on. Everyone thought that kids had to learn to lip read, which is actually impossible if you don't already have a language. And they were forbidden from signing and so on. But of
Hmm.
course, the kids in the playground would be signing to one another.
Yeah.
And over the first year or two, the first generation of kids formed a kind of pigeon home sign, right? I mean, it was
Hmm.
a common home sign that they could use to communicate.
Hmm.
But as the next wave of kids came in, that language got regularized so that it had things that are markers of, as it were, proper language, like verb
Hmm.
agreement, right?
Hmm.
Now, that was coming from them. It was coming out of the minds of the kids that they're taking as input something that's a very impoverished language and
Yeah.
spontaneously adding structure to it. So lots of people think that's one of the strongest arguments that the mind contains not just expectations of structure, but the drive to impose a certain kind of structure.
Yeah. I mean, it's just foundational, right? I mean, communication is what made us survive. Those who could communicate, I would imagine, survived. So it's sort of a selection advantage. And there are different types of communications. And so when you're handicapped with, no audio or no visual or whatever, you find other ways to use sort of the same processes to try to survive. And so that must have happened 100,000 years. And so now we find humans who are driven by the need to communicate. I'm just making a statement. Peter, you can object to it. Driven by the need to communicate, which means that when babies are born, if you have some sort of an application in there that is fundamentally about communication, you have probably a higher chance of survival, I would think.
Yes, although it's yeah, I mean, certainly being able to communicate with others is um, crucial for normal social functioning, which is why isolated deaf people have problems, right? And once people brain damage and aphasia, it can cause you all kinds of problems in interacting with others. Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah. Yeah, so that seems like a design fault in the sense that if nature believed communication is fundamental, it seems like a pretty bad design in the sense that, if if you get some damage in some small part of your brain and you're sort of left out in the cold, I would have imagined that nature would have designed something that is more distributed, more fault tolerant, let me put it that way. But we don't find that, right?
Well, it's not a small part of the brain. The language network is really quite large,
Hmm.
from prefrontal cortex back to parietal cortex, and there's a huge, long, massive. It's called the articulate fasciculus or something like that. My Latin is not very good, which is
Okay.
a long white matter pathway connecting the two. So
Yeah.
it's a. I mean, we think in terms of networks nowadays, not local areas that do stuff on the whole.
Yeah. So I saw a study. I don't know if you've seen this. So I saw a study that said that, language is generally known to be on the left side of the brain. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Normally,
And if you have some sort of damage to the left side of the brain in the first 2, 3 years, then the right side starts to specialize in it, and
no,
then you could still do pretty okay.
yeah.
But then after 3 years, if you get a damage on the left side, you're pretty much left in the cold. Is that what we find from a cognitive science perspective?
I don't know that literature terribly well, but I think what you're saying is right. That there's certainly a lot of brain plasticity, especially over the first 2 or 3 years of life, because the way things happen is there's initial neural proliferation through the womb and also shortly after birth, and then it gets pruned back around the age of 2. So the connections that aren't being used very much get cut out. So things get a lot more efficient, but also and more streamlined, and that continues for some time, I think. So yeah, the brain continues to mature, of course, and change quite a bit, especially prefrontal cortex and its connections with the rest of the brain. But it looks like there are some things that it's hard to recover once you've lost them.
Yeah, so this sort of pushes into nativism, right? In the sense that the brain comes with specialization, it seems to me, in many different areas. And from an analytical perspective, we got 8 billion samples of humans running around. You look into your brain, it looks sort of similar. It's all, or, it's like 8 billion Windows 11 out there. And it's very difficult to see how such consistency and um, design attributes that can be there unless it is sort of implemented at birth. It goes back to sort of the nativistic argument.
Well, yeah. So the network architecture of the brain is fixed pretty early, and
Yeah.
that's certainly innate. I mean, it doesn't follow from that there are domain-specific cognitive systems as opposed to sensory systems, and then connections among sensory systems and connections to general systems like that will run working memory and take decisions, and all that's domain general, right? It happens. It's different things happening, but you can take decisions about the physical world or about the social world or about numbers, or it doesn't matter what domain you're dealing with. So what's controversial about contemporary nativism, the way it's debated, is all about whether there's domain-specific learning systems, in particular, things that focus on particular domains like language or like other people's minds.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to go further into this. So you say here humans are also uniquely powerfully motivated to attend to and represent the mental states and dispositions of other members of the social group independent of context. Um, yeah, so this makes intuitive sense from a survival perspective. But then is that transferable? So what do we find from a data perspective? So um, people who can sort of understand other people early on clearly has a survival benefit. But when they have babies, are those babies come with this sort of an application? Do we have any data on that?
Yes, a lot, although it's still to some degree controversial. So we've got a lot of infancy studies using a range of different output measures. So there's expectancy violation paradigms where you show the kids a social scenario, right? Where the famous case is what's come to be called the Sally Ann task, where there are 2 girls and one has a ball that she's playing with and she puts it in the basket and goes out to play. And while she's away, the other girl takes the ball out of the basket and puts it in a box. And then she goes out, and then the original agent comes back. And the question is, where will she go for her ball? She has a false belief about the location of her ball. So if you're tracking her beliefs, you'll expect her to where she left it, namely in the basket. Whereas if you're tracking just where the ball is and you expect her to go to the ball, she'll go to the box, right? And so you can show that little scenario or versions of it and show different kids different endings. Either she goes to the basket where she would expect the person to go if she was tracking their beliefs, or you show the ending going to the ball, right? And if they look longer at the second, then they're puzzled. Because why did she go to the basket? She doesn't the box. She doesn't know it's in the box, and so on. So
These
there's a
are
whole
all
range of,
same age. Sorry to interrupt. So it's all same age
that can
kids.
be measured at many different ages. It started off in the field using
Yeah.
language-based tasks, and kids didn't start to pass that until about the age of 4. But using measures like expectancy violation, how long you look when your expectancy is violated, we get it down to 8 months. And a whole range of different kinds of measures in between, right? So you can have helping tasks where what counts as helping someone depends upon what they think about the situation, right? Where they think something is, right? So there's a lot of different tasks that suggest that kids are not just powerfully attending to other social agents, but have some understanding of social agents from the start, that they come expecting them to have goals and expecting them to be able to sensorily access the world, see and hear, and understand things like occlusion. So if there's a barrier in between, then they don't know what's going on the other side of the barrier, and so on.
Yeah, very interesting. So I want to go into another topic here. So you say we possess a number of innate biases for cultural learning and cultural teaching,
Right.
as well as for identifying and generalizing about outgroups, which meant generalizing about other tribes throughout most of our evolutionary history. Yeah, so this is not only in our evolutionary history, Peter. This is contemporary meaning. We have
Absolutely.
we have 200 countries warring against each other in 2025.
Yeah.
And yeah, so we haven't lost any of our tribal inclinations, have we?
No, I mean, have you come across the word weird cultures?
No.
So that's basically you and me now.
Yes.
Western, industrialized, educated, democratic, and hang on, I've missed something out. Oh, rich and democratic. And it turns out that people in those cultures are weird by all kinds of measures, right? So weird is a joke, right? On cognitive measures, on even perceptual measures, they differ. And of course, people in liberal democracies believe everyone's equal, everyone deserves equal respect. But it's actually belied in their behavior. I mean, that's a goal, an aspiration, or something they're committed to. But when it, comes down to it, they still are emoting in tribal terms, right? And emoting in terms of us versus them. But the background to all this is that humans have always lived in tribes up until 10,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And tribes are marked by language, dialect.
And typically less than 150 members, I think. It's very small. Yeah.
Tribes tend to be larger, right?
Okay.
So people an ethno-linguistic group tends to, as far as we can tell from a combination of what things were like in Australia when Europeans first arrived, isolated communities around the world, and archaeological evidence, probably around about 1,000 adults.
1,000. Yeah.
But then you have traveling bands that forage together of about 30, who camp together and hunt together, and the whole tribe might get together occasionally for ceremonial purposes or
drinking alcohol,
to build a weir for fishing, and consuming alcohol, perhaps. So it was vital both to, so important background fact, the traveling groups are mostly made up of unrelated individuals. So only about a quarter would be blood kin, and people move in and out of groups quite often, either to go visit with relatives or to get away from the people they've not liking so much in the group they're in, and so on. So crucial to have a positive expectation of people you're cooperating with, because you arrive in a new group, you've got to get into a hunting party, or you've got to go foraging with some of the women or whatever. And one of the most remarkable findings from contemporary psychology is what's called the minimal group effect.
Okay.
So you put people into a small group of, say, 4 with whom they're going to cooperate. It can be marked by just yellow T-shirts against green T-shirts. Or it can be done totally anonymously on the internet. But it always involves some cooperative task.
Yeah.
And as soon as a minimal group is set up, you get a whole raft of downstream positive expectations and evaluations of your in-group. You're prepared to share resources with them. You expect to trust them more than the out-group. You empathize with them more. In one of the big analyses of these findings, there's 44 different things that come with just being a member of a minimal group. And these are strong effects. They're at least as strong as racial biases, and indeed they can override racial biases. You form minimal groups of different races, and people stop encoding the race. They encode group membership, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's really powerful in many ways. So does this mean that we are doomed?
Well, so this is the good side, right? That you have innate pro-social motivations to those who you praise as a member of your own group.
Yeah.
But the darker side is tribes were often competing with one another, and not
Of
just
course, for
competing with one
resources,
another,
yeah.
but murderous. So violent death rates among hunter-gatherers, let me see if I can remember the number. I think at least 25 times higher than death rates and murder rates in the US, 180 times higher than in Germany, right? So there was mostly done through sneak raids.
Yeah.
In the same sort of way that chimpanzees do, right? As you probably know, male chimpanzees go on border patrols. They sort of sneak carefully around the edge of their territory. And if they come across an isolated chimpanzee from another group, or a smaller group, small enough group that they can attack without risk to themselves, they attack and kill. And the death rates among chimpanzees are about the same as the violent death rates among hunter-gatherers.
Do we have, I know that this is difficult data, but do we have some data on like gender differences in this violent deaths?
It's more often male. And here we have to look more at, or in part, at archaeological evidence, where you look at evidence of violent deaths and broken bones and heads and things. Sneak raids will sometimes kill everyone indiscriminately. Sometimes it's just the warriors, and kids might be left, or females might be kidnapped to become wives of the raiding group. And that's similar among chimpanzees too. Sometimes they'll grab a female and incorporate her into their group. But I mean, kind of makes sense, right? The important people to kill if you're fighting another group are the warriors themselves, because they're the ones who are immediate dangers to you.
Yeah, I mean, there's some implication for the societal design. That's where I was thinking, I mean, if you survive next few decades, it seems unlikely at this point. Um, and some better society comes along and redesigns it. It has, I mean, all this data is quite useful to think about. I always argued when you have large systems like the US or India or something like that, women are in a much better position to manage very complex systems because they have a lot of experience with it. Men, I think, are more process oriented. They go out in the morning, try to hunt the rhino, whatever, bring the meat back. I mean, that is pretty optimizable process. Whereas managing a society is not optimizable in a very easy way. So there appears to be some sort of a gender difference that has implication for societal design, I think. I'm just making this up, Peter. I just let you react to it.
I don't know of any evidence that that group-based biases and evaluations are any different in men and women. On the whole, women tend to be slightly better at mentalizing type stuff, right, at social cognition than men. But when it comes to the biases, I don't think there's any gender differences. I will tell you an interesting thing about hunter-gatherer tribes, though, I mean, I mentioned earlier they were egalitarian in structure.
Yeah.
And it looks like they were egalitarian across the sexes too, because there's a really nice paper which tried to model the composition of these traveling groups, right? So what forces would lead you to have the mix of close relatives, distant relatives, and strangers in the same group together? And basically, the explanation from the model is that if both men and women would prefer to live with their relatives, but each have equal power over who they actually live with, you get the distribution I've just described, which is some blood relatives, mostly strangers. Now, don't ask me to explain the math, but I found that a really cool finding that suggested, the ancestral condition, men and women are actually equal. There's always gendered work distribution, in part because it's really hard to go on a long hunt if you're still breastfeeding an infant, right? There's limitations on what you can do, but
yeah. I mean, this goes back to the nativism argument that you're making, Peter. So the local observations that we make today appears to have a huge gender bias, appears to have huge cultural biases, even tactical things like skin color and stuff like that, right? So that's what we observe tactically. But the question would be, in the nativist ideas, are those? I know the answer to this. It is no, because I can see babies, and they don't see color, color of skin or gender or anything like that. So the operating system came with no specific biases, but very soon, very, very soon, I would imagine, it starts to accumulate biases, right? That's what we are finding.
Yes, that you form expectations about groups in something like the way you form expectations about animal species. So the basic way of encoding information about groups and species is in terms of what's called a generic, right? So it's without qualification, things like birds fly. And people will endorse that, even though they know, of course, that not all birds do. And people will store information about, especially about negative properties that apply to just a tiny minority, like, well, let's take something that just is 50-50. Mosquitoes bite. In fact, only females do, right? But everyone thinks mosquitoes bite, right? And deer ticks carry West Lyme disease. West Nile, what?
West Nile,
Lyme disease. And only a tiny minority of them do, but it's still important information to have, right? You get a tick on you, you want to get it off. So information is stored in that way, and it looks like people do the same with social groups. Hence stereotypes, which are basically generics about a social group.
Yeah, so that's an interesting sort of experimental question. Are stereotypes learned empirically?
Yes, stereotypes are learned. Yeah, no one thinks that those are innate. I mean, it may be that they're using an innate frame, as it were, like put it into a generic form frame.
Yeah.
And I think it's innate that humans have expectations of what groups are like. There's, again, really nice data with infants where they expect little animated shapes on the screen that say dance together, doing one sort of dance over here and a different sort of dance over here. So these are two different groups. And then if one of these folks affiliates with one of these, they're surprised. Whereas if one of these affiliates with another one, no, and they expect the people in this group to help other members of this group if they're in conflict with that group and so on. And this is all in the first year of life or soon after. And
Yeah.
they won't know anything about groups at that stage, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you're in contact with your family basically, and your close relatives, and there might be, a childminder or something, but there's no exposure to social groups at that age, and yet they seem to come primed to expect social groups and have expectations about how social groups will behave.
Yeah. So, you get a clean operating system when you're born, and very soon you're put into this biased world, and then you start to pick up all sorts of noisy information and make decisions on it. So, exposed, we see biases are everybody is a walking bundle of bias, I would say.
Yeah.
And I don't know where it starts, but once it starts, I don't think there is any going back on it.
It's hard. I mean, people are trying to work on ways of. I mean, one of the most promising ways actually is cooperative groups, right? Because we've got the minimal group effect and we know that as soon as you put members of different races into a cooperative group,
Mm,
they immediately start feeling differently about those individuals. How
yeah.
you scale that up? Well, I mean, it suggests that it was a good thing that there were lots of white people marching alongside Martin Luther King,
Mm,
because this was then not just them against us. This was us, white people and black people protesting,
mm.
right, together about the same thing. And that kind of message is important, I think. But how you scale it up to actually address these issues, no one
Yeah. So
really
let me
knows.
ask you this, Peter. Sorry to interrupt. So let me ask you this. So if us and them is sort of a firmware. I hate to use computer analogy here. Us and them is sort of a firmware, meaning, yeah, I mean, make sure you are in the us place because that gives you a higher probability of survival than
Right.
them. So if it is nativistic expectation of us and them, perhaps when the babies are born, they don't know who is us and who is them.
Well, no, sure.
But very quickly, there's a lot of data, that tells them who is us and who is them. And it seems like it's an irreversible process, right? Because sort of the process part of this is programmed in, saying if you figure out who is us, you'll survive fast, survive better. So it is sort of a nativistic competence, but there's no content in it when you're born. But you get content very, very quickly. It doesn't take too many years to acquire all this content that goes through this process. That is, I'm just making this up, Pete.
Well,
That is nativistic. Yeah.
no, that's right. But you unfortunately you can't control the input that infants are going to get. I mean, if you could do what you do with the chicks, you lock them away in a room and just give them the kind of input that you want. But of course, you can't.
So I want to finish up with something else you said here. So for many now live largely alone or in small families without significant social support, and this is an increasing problem, as you know, and
Mm.
lack the sense of belonging characteristic of life in small scale communities. We are tribal creatures striving to adapt to a cosmopolitan world. Yeah, so that is a huge tension
Yeah.
all around the world. Um, I can think of any solution to it. I think this is almost like a runaway train phenomenon for me. Unless somebody can get into the train and pull the levers, I think we are, well, let me make it very pessimistic. I think we are sort of doomed.
It's really hard. I mean, of course, you know, people have been sort of aware of this for a long time. I mean, one of the reasons why many big universities like my own divides things up into different houses, right? So there's the language house, and so you put together people who can, and it's likewise they're in fraternities and sororities,
Yeah.
right? That you form a smaller group that you can feel you belong to and so on. But translating that into the real world where people have to travel every which way for jobs, and it's. I did read one thing recently that suggested one of the outcomes of remote working might be to enable small towns to exist again and for people to stay sedentary in the sense of not having to move away, right? That you can stay with your family and your friends and the people you grow up with, and you can be doing work that's basically its headquarters are the other side of the country or the other side of the world. But how one develops the incentives to let that happen or encourage that to happen, I suspect it'd be really good for people's mental health if it did. But
yeah, so we're going the other way, Peter. You know, the large companies in the country, 4 of them appear to have all the resources that the country has. They're creating silicon mountains and sequestering all the electricity to make what they call artificial intelligence. And they want all their employees to come back to the office. Why? Well, that sounds like an interesting idea. But nobody is sort of looking at the societal impact of all these policy decisions. But it's it's four companies make all these decisions for 300 million people right now. And that is not a system that's sustainable, I think.
I mean, this is now getting totally outside my areas of expertise, but you'd think it's not terribly democratic either, right? How we get back individual democratic control of these immensely rich multinational corporations is a big problem, I think.
Excellent. Yeah, this has been great, Peter. Thanks so much for spending time with me. I know that we explored areas outside your book. I found the book really, really interesting. And it's a very important question. You know, do humans come with some established notions, established ideas? We clearly know the mechanistic parts are there. I mean, you know how to breathe, the heart has to know how to pump. That part is pretty well established. The question is, does the brain have things that are already sort of pre-programmed? And my intuition is that there are a lot of pre-programming going on there too.
Me too. And I think the evidence suggests it as well. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. Thanks so much for spending time with me, Peter.
Okay. No, thanks. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Cheers.